Well, good afternoon, and welcome back to Thompson Hine's Coffee Chat series. My name is Cassandra Borchers. I'm a partner in our investment management and blockchain cryptocurrency practice. And today we are beginning the first of another three-part series on fulfilling fiduciary duties for mutual fund boards. We'll be focusing on best practices in succession planning within this series. So going forward, we will also discuss recruiting and onboarding new directors. You can register for these sessions the same way that you registered for this one. But now I would like to introduce our panelists. So I have the privilege of being joined today by an exceptionally experienced panelist, all three of them, including Dina Tantra, who is an independent board director and chair for the Heartland funds. Dina is also chair of the Nominating and Governance Committee for Boston Trust Walden Funds and Thornburg Income Builder Opportunities Trust. And she also serves on the Mutual Fund Directors Forum as a board member. Next, we have Elsie Fletcher, CFA, board observer for Clear Cut Medical, Finance and Governance Committee, and lead independent trustee for Equity Multi-Strategy Closed-End Fund. And finally, Anita Zagrotnik, who is an independent trustee for Madison Funds in the Ultra Series Funds and a member of the Audit and Nominating and Governance Committee for those funds. So today we are planning to equip you with essential insights and practical tips for navigating and mastering the board succession planning process, which is not for the faint of heart. We are hoping that today's discussion will be interactive. So if you have a comment or a question, you can use the chat box. It should be in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And just go ahead and pop it in there whenever you would like. We will address a lot of those questions during the course of the program and then follow up at the end with any that we didn't get to. So with that, let's get started. All right, ladies, thank you again for joining us in this first of this three-part series on governance and best practices when it comes to board succession planning. The first thing I'd like to do is start with an overview. As you all know, and I'm expecting most people on the call know, there are legal and regulatory requirements for governance of a board. And within a variety of different legal documents, policies and procedures, committee charters, et cetera, these can all be found. So that includes governing documents such as the Declaration of Trust and bylaws. There are regulatory requirements and guidelines for the percentage of the board that need to be independent trustees. And that would be independent from any advisors to the trust, the distributor to the trust, et cetera. There are proxy voting requirements. So the board members of the trust are required to be elected by the shareholders to the individual funds. At the commencement of any new trust or any new fund, you have an initial sole shareholder who makes that approval, and then there are percentages that need to be maintained going forward. So we'll talk about that in a little bit with respect to the process. Obviously, timing and cost increase, once you've already got a fund up and running, if you need to replace or add a board member. Structure of the board, including how you want to set out who's the chair, committees and committee chairs, all of those are actually part of the succession planning process, not just the board member themselves. There is also regulatory requirements for self-assessments. These are annual self-assessments, and they can be very useful in the context of governing board and in the succession process. And then retirement policies and procedures, other board guidelines, like I said, charters that you might use for independent or for the different committees that you'll use for the board that govern, how many members of the board need to be independent, how many there are, chair, et cetera. And that committee structure really goes toward how this board is going to govern with respect to the funds in the trust. So while there are a plethora of topics that we could cover from a succession planning handbook, we're going to start off with retirement policies, self-assessments, and board leadership. That's what we're going to be talking about today. We have planned additional webinars in this series to focus on recruitment and onboarding And we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge that there are so many topics in the field of succession planning that we could really talk for hours. So let's start out beginning with retirement policies. For this, I'm going to hand it over to Dina to lead us in the group discussion.
Great. Thanks, Cassandra. And, she's right. There's a variety of topics. And just on this topic of retirement, we could talk for hours, right? So we are trying to limit it to 15 minutes, everything you want to know about retirement policies. But as the four of us were talking, I kind of think of succession planning as this continuum, right? You start with retirement and then you move on to your self-assessment, your talent matrix, thinking about what do you have currently, what do you aspire to, and then you move into kind of that recruiting process, which we'll cover in another section about, who's in your pipeline, how do you interview the candidates, and then how do you onboard them, which is our final of the series. And then it goes back to retirement again, right? And then it's just this ongoing circle. I think when I think about retirement, it's a little bit different than other board topics because it's more than just sort of rational, logical policy making. There's a lot of emotion and personalities that come out when you're talking about individuals and their roles and how they show up at the board table. And so I think of it more as an art and a science to these discussions. And I think that can be hard for board members because it's not just a black and white conversation. You're not talking about proxy voting. You're not talking about fund liquidity. This is people's livelihoods. This is people's identity. And one of the things to think about is succession planning is about maintaining stability for the board, as well as enhancing the board over time as your funds evolve, and really acting in the best interest of the shareholders. And when things get too emotional, it's time to pull back a little bit and say, okay, what's in the best interest of the shareholders? And I think that will help you in all of your conversations. So let's sort of dive in. The boards I'm on, and Elsie and Anita, weigh in here. We have kind of strict age limits. So when a board member turns 75, at the end of that year is kind of when our retirement hits. Is that how yours operate as well?
Yeah, so it's very similar. We actually use age 76, but it is exactly the same thing. So at the end of the year, so December of the year that they turn 76. And that's relatively new. There used to be term limits, and that was just changed to a retirement age.
How long was the term limit?
I believe they were 10 years because they just did it before I joined the board to switch it out. But I'm pretty sure it was either 10 or 15 years.
And Elsie?
Mine is the same. It's the age of 75, but I do know other friends that have boards with term limits, and they're usually 10 or 15 years. And my private company board, it's totally different because of the lifestyle, the life cycle of that board. When it's a startup board, you have different requirements for your board versus you move into commercialization, you have different requirements. So between the private boards and the mutual fund boards, it's a totally different animal.
Yeah. And I've seen all sorts of age limits, right? I've seen 72, I've seen 80, and I've seen some with none. And that kind of gets us to that next conversation, right? When somebody hits an age, they may be fully qualified to continue on as a board member, right? There's also the issue that before they hit that age, they are no longer qualified to continue on as a board member. And that's where I think you end up having courageous conversations. And again, these are not conversations you normally have about 12B1 fees or something of that effect. Although you may have them about 12B1 fees, but typically you don't have them about, something that's a little more black and white. The challenge is people's identities, people's desire to serve the shareholders is very deep and personal. And there's a desire to stay on, perhaps even beyond these term limits. And I have heard of, some boards have waivers, right? So you have a term limit and then you can apply for a waiver, and they may have different forms of that waiver. But then you have this sort of strange situation. What if two people apply for a waiver, but you really only want to grant one person? Or what if you grant two people the waiver now, but the next person who comes up, you don't really want to grant the waiver? Or what if you grant a waiver and then they want another waiver? And so it just keeps happening. And people talk about, well, just have a courageous conversation about, so-and-so, Jim, Jane, you're really not serving in the best interest of the shareholders. That's not easy when you're colleagues. You might have that in an employment situation, but when you're a peer sitting at the table, it's very difficult to sort of opine on someone and their capabilities. And yes, you can have the chair do it, but the chair is also a colleague. You can maybe look to counsel or an outside facilitator. But my advice is just to remember that have some empathy, have some compassion, but also realize that what you need to do as a board needs to be in the best interest of the shareholders. Yeah. So, you might set up these what seem like draconian retirement policies, but sometimes it's easier to plan for a retirement at a set age than to have to navigate, is this person good or not? So I'll pause there and see if Anita and Elsie have some other thoughts.
Yeah, so I'd like to add, in my previous work life, we had a situation with a board where the independent lead trustee, he was getting close to retirement age. The previous one had been there, they had done a waiver, but this individual felt that it would be really good to set an example. And so he did retire at the retirement age. And he was pretty explicit to say during the board meeting, we've set this age limit for a reason, and I'm going to set the example. And it worked really well. The next gentleman who was due up in a year later, then he also retired at that age limit. And there were no more of these discussions, because as you said, that same board previously, a few years before, had a trustee where it wasn't the trustee so much that was failing. However, their spouse was, and then they were not showing up to a number of meetings. And at that time, there was no, ability to do a board meeting via Zoom. It was you were in person, and, they would miss 3 out of 4. And it was really a struggle to get them in on that 4th one. So sometimes it really isn't just about the individual. It's really sort of the whole situation. And as to your point, Dina, that was a tough conversation to have. This gentleman was younger. He was very good, but he wasn't showing up. And so there was a tough conversation, that courageous one. And, sorry, Cassandra, but we did use counsel in some respects to really kind of set that stage and not to, be blunt about it, but rather, get them off the board and push them out. So it can be difficult.
Anita, I think the gentleman that did take the stand of "it's my time is up" and leave, I think that was a very courageous, bold move. And as you said, it set an example. I think this issue of waivers really became very prominent during COVID, because that's the first time people started using Zoom for meetings. And it was very easy to say, I need to stay on because of COVID. I know I was interviewing for a board during that period, and one board member said, "I only want to interview in person." Well, that went on for almost 2.5 years. And so it's very hard when you've got some sort of outstanding circumstance like COVID to actually do that. I think Dina's point of what's best for the shareholders. You are a fiduciary. And a number of the excuses for why I want to stay on is historical perspective. And the reality is the fund product lines change, governance changed, compliance changes. So how far back do you really need history? And you can, again, Cassandra, you can rely on your counsel for a lot of this history.
And I'll see to that point, and we can talk more about it when we talk about sort of that development of leadership. But another counsel had advised me of what about kind of creating sort of this institutional repository of information that can be passed along to the next generation, maybe through the onboarding, maybe through the leadership development. But just saying institutional knowledge just kicks the can, right? You know,
Exactly.
At some point, you do need to, and we'll talk more about it, but you need to sort of say, okay, it's time for one generation to exit because it's absolutely time for a refresh of the board. And I think that's probably a perfect segue to our next conversation. I will just say, with retirement, I always think of this as a bit bittersweet because in my perspective, the best leaders set up the board table so that it is functioning not only just as well, but maybe even better when they're gone. And that's difficult, but that's really a legacy that you've set it up in such a successful way and you've empowered the board to move along that you can just sort of exit stage left. So with that, I would toss it over to Elsie, who's going to talk kind of the next step of, okay, what's the self-assessment and how do you start to think about where you're at and where you're going?
Okay, sure. Well, each board is required, regulatory requirement to do a self-assessment each year. And the board chair can lead this process, council can lead it, some boards bring in outside experts or consultants to lead this. But what this process does is really inform the board of where they are in terms of skill sets, talent. You can put a number of factors into these matrices. You can put diversity, gender, age, skill sets that you have, skill sets that you would like to have. And what you're really doing is sort of a gap analysis. This is what I have. This is what I don't have. So new skill sets will change over the years as different products change. As I said, compliance, technology changes, regulatory changes. And so I think it's important that every year when you do this, you note what you would like to have on this board that you don't have. You don't have to act on it. You're not doing a search every year, but you just make note of what would be nice to have in terms of a skill set. So that when you get to the point where you're actually making a change, you look back at that list every year. And I think what some of the times you'll find that skills you identified maybe 3 or 4 years ago aren't that relevant. Maybe your fund company thought they were going to start an ESG fund or something, and that really never happened, or they thought they were going to be working in the crypto area. So you'll be able to eliminate something. And the point is that everything you identify is not always something you really need. It's a nice to have. So when you get ready. Yeah.
When you had mentioned a phrase you use when you do this as self-assessment, what skills didn't we have at the table this year that we think we needed? And I just love sort of that analysis. It's not just about what do we have, but what are we missing?
And what do we think we need going forward? So that's the basic crux of what you're doing when you're looking at skill sets. And then that translates into when you have when you do have an opening, that is going to be the document that you refer back to in terms of what skill sets are we looking for.
And Elsie, when you do that analysis, do you think about how do you educate up the current board in case the gap is just a matter of bringing in some presenters or having people go to different conferences or get certifications? Or is it something that you can't really learn up, but you need to have a lived experience?
Dina, that's a very, very critical question, because I think so many people seem to think that they need to have that lived experience. And I think something like, I'm going to throw out AI because that's the buzzword right now. Do you need an AI expert on your board? And I think the board has to step back and say, what do I want to know about AI? Do I want to know how it affects my back office, how it affects my shareholder, my portfolio manager, my fund management company? And you're never going to find one person that has all that knowledge. So I think at the beginning, anyway, of a new trend or new technology, you bring in experts that teach the board a day exercise, allow the board to ask those questions. And I think another trap you can fall into is when you're looking at these types of expertise. And I've seen boards hire outside the industry straight into expertise. The crux of your board is governance, compliance, 15C. You've got all these other things that person needs to lead. So you want to make sure you're not shifting more work onto your existing board to take on that specialty. Are some of my thoughts about it.
Yeah. Make sure that they're not too narrow in scope, quite honestly.
Exactly.
Let's see, right? But I also think this really brings up the whole conversation that we had in terms of pipeline and just that constant pipeline, right? It may not be that you really need the pipeline, but all of these sort of looks at your board composition and where you are every year based on new rules, SEC changes, what's their focus. I mean, it's really important to just keep a solid pipeline in your back pocket for when you do need a new board member, whether it's retirement or some other, event that triggers someone leaving the board.
I'm going to be selfish and deviate for about 30 seconds because I know some people who have dialed in are related to a board that I'm affiliated with. And this question of pipeline has come up, and I know they would love to hear from more than just me. So, I kind of ask you guys about your thoughts on pipeline, because say your planned retirements are 2, 3, 5 years out. How do you manage that pipeline so it stays fresh, that you're communicating effectively with candidates? Because you want to know if the candidate is interested should a spot open, but you also know that if it's a planned retirement, that spot may not open for 3 years or 5 years. I do want to mention that we should also be planning for that sort of unexpected retirement, right? Anita kind of alluded to if somebody unfortunately passes away or can no longer serve, all of a sudden you're reacting quickly. But to the extent it's a planned retirement, how do you keep that pipeline fresh without sort of stringing somebody along for years?
Well, I think what's really important, Dina, is some of us have been in the industry for a really long time. And now, given some of our board positions, we have the opportunities to go to a number of events, such as, we'll just say the IDC, Mutual Fund Directors Forum. They have a lot of this. So, you not only have the ability to keep in touch with those individuals that may or may not already be on a board, right? So, and you can kind of, it's not that you're saying, oh, we have something next week, but at least you're getting to know that individual better in sort of a more informal setting and what their interests are, the dinners that they hold, or just even, Dina, we've got an informal group of our own that we keep in touch with. We have some informal breakfast, dinners, lunches, etc. And I think that's part of it, because it's not just a specific skill set, it's the soft skills too, right? Like looking for somebody coming out of compliance, or looking for, somebody with AI experience. Yes, you would like all of that, but you also want the soft skills that individual will mesh really well with the board. So in my mind, we've got on the boards that I'm sitting on right now, we have a number of years before we are going to have somebody retire. It's going to be 3.5 years, but we are already having those conversations. And this particular board generally uses a networking. You can do the networking, which is what I was saying in terms of going to a conference and meeting new people. What are their interests? Or, it's amazing because I'm sure all of you have had the same experience. You have so many people reaching out to you. Sometimes they don't even know them, but they'll reach out because they know that you're on a board. And that's one way to build that pipeline. And like I said, we've got a long ways yet to go, but we are sort of informally trying to keep that network fresh. Does that make sense? I think, Dina, you do a lot of that as well.
Elsie, did you?
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that is just as well as board networking, your vendors, your counsel, your audit will also have people reaching out to them for boards, and they can help you identify candidates, as well as Mutual Fund Directors Forum has a database. Correct. And there are a couple of diversity databases also that you can reach into. That's usually when you're looking for a specific skill set, but I think the soft touch is really one of the primary drivers.
Right. And I see we have a question.
We do. We have a question from a friend of mine, I think a friend of many people probably on this call, asking, we're curious on our thoughts for the needs for a fresh perspective, which may favor term limits over potential diminished capacity, which may favor age limits. And I feel like traditionally the retirement policies have been more focused on age, but this concept of just bringing in fresh blood from time to time is an important one. And how have you addressed that within each of your boards, or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think the reality is, thinking about sort of that 15-year term limit, many boards are already sort of hitting that with an age policy, because a lot of people aren't getting elected to their boards till maybe the age of 60. There are a few of us who have a slightly longer runway. So it may end up being a wash, but I think that's exactly what the self-assessment topic is about, is what do we have today? I think the self-assessment should be done in conjunction with the strategic plan for the firm, right? And so where should we be heading? What should we be thinking about in terms of new and different skill sets? And I think, with the diversity lens, having people from different backgrounds really brings different perspectives to a common goal. And so I think people learn from that. And whether it's term limits or age, part of my rationale for wanting to stick to a retirement policy is just that it is time for some people to move on and the next generation to come in. And one example of generational is just retail sales, right? And the younger generations have a different perspective of how they buy things than the older generations, right? Just by the way that they operate on a daily basis. And I think we miss out if we don't continually refresh. I do think term limits can get you there, but I think in my experience, it all kind of is a wash, because a lot of people join their boards around age 60 or so. So they end up being sort of 15 years.
To add to that though, Dina, I think what's really important when you are evaluating bringing a new board member on board, what is their personality? Are they curious? Because I will tell you that perspective and that fresh perspective, if you are a curious person and you like to learn and you are going to participate in things like a Mutual Fund Directors Forum or IDC and really participate, listen, I think you can bring continuous perspective, let's just say, right? Because you're learning from others just all along the way. So in addition to the whole, age versus term limit thing, I just think having the individuals on your board that want to make a difference, that want to learn, that are curious, and that continuously bring, that fresh perspective, not necessarily meaning young perspective, just a fresh perspective. Yeah. Does that kind of make sense?
Oh, yeah. And to your earlier point about going to conferences, I do think that's another good way, besides the networking, but just to bring sort of external learning into your boardroom.
Yeah.
I know a lot of, all fund families are sort of weighing the expense versus the benefit. Sure. And I think you can do it in a variety of ways, right? There are webinars that you can attend. There's, Thompson Hine webinars that are free and a fabulous source of information. But I think making sure that you are involved and hearing different perspectives is key. I did want to add one thing, Elsie, when you think about kind of self-assessment and getting to know your fellow board members. One of the things we've been trying to institute is taking that required annual self-assessment and breaking it into chunks. So we are embedding part of the self-assessment in every quarterly meeting as opposed to one at the end of the year. I don't know about some of you, but sometimes I feel that self-assessment at the end of the year gets ramped, right? You have other things you're working on and that gets short shrift. We also work on having more kind of informal social gatherings of the board, whether it's the board dinners and sometimes board dinners of just the independents or the independents and the interested trustees. We're also working on some kind of team building exercises, maybe a cooking class, or we rolled out axe throwing, but you know what I mean, certain things. And I would be remiss in saying they don't always have to involve alcohol. One of the challenges of going to a board dinner is there often is this single glass of wine that just keeps filling and refilling for hours and hours. And I think you can accomplish some of this informal team building without the glass of wine. It may help, but I suggest that people think creatively about how you get to know your fellow board members for that cultural piece of it.
Right. Only thing I can add to your great comments is that we've talked about term limits and we've talked about age limits. But what we haven't talked about, and there are still some boards out there that have no policy on retirement. And that is a board that has probably become very stagnant. And that is a really hard situation. I knew someone that entered a board like that. It was a friend of founders kind of board. Which happens, very common. And people were very old or impaired in their health. And someone had to stand up and say, we need a retirement policy. And so that also can be very sticky.
Yeah. I think, as we talk about age, maybe it is a great segue to our next topic, which is kind of leadership rotation, right? How do you keep leadership fresh, which also is has a lot of landmines if you're not dealing with it carefully. But Anita, you want to lead us in this part of the conversation?
Yeah. So I think, not only bringing new blood on in the right fit for the board, but also a lot of times the more senior individuals on your board are the ones who are the, chairman or the lead independent trustee or the head of audit committee or the head of the nominating governance committee. So as you're bringing on some new board members, just the thoughts of, well, would any of these individuals be good to become the next audit committee chair or the next nominating committee chair or the lead independent as you're working your way, towards retirement for some individuals? And I have to say, I am new to my board. I joined in May of 2024, and it's really been a great experience all around. I'm fortunate that the two more senior individuals on this board, they are very forward thinking and they are looking for new leadership and they're always thinking about it. In particular, the head of our nominating governance committee, who also is the lead independent trustee. And it's fun. And to your point earlier about these informal types of events, he reaches out a lot. He has conversations with myself, and in terms of what my interest would be going forward, given my background. And the fourth member of our board, he is also, of the independent part of the board, he is also relatively newer to this board, and he has conversations with him as well. Like, what are your interests going forward? So I think that's really important when you have those senior members that do see the benefit in new leadership. This year, because I was new too, and the other individuals fairly new, they are still staying on as the audit committee chair and the nominating governance committee chair, which they may still do for a year or two. But I know, given their propensity to think about leadership and going forward, we may come to the point where they say, let's do a rotation, because I do think a lot of times boards say, well, we really should rotate through our board, even if you've got experienced members who've been there for 10 years. But, who is interested now in doing the audit committee, or who has the background to do so? And some of the boards that I've worked with in my prior life, they were also pretty good about that whole, let's do a little bit of a rotation, which again brings up some fresh perspectives to the whole process.
Anita, question for you, because I can see logistically how rotating committee chairs would work. Although I would say, with smaller fund boards, the challenge of the audit committee chair, I think, is a little stickier, right? I don't believe, and Cassandra, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe your chair has to be your qualified financial expert, but it tends to be kind of a recommended practice. As long as you have the qualified financial expert on the committee, I think that's good. But I think most boards tend to lean on their QFE as their chair. And if you only have one qualified financial expert, that rotation becomes very strange. But aside from that, and I've heard of some of the rotations maybe being 3 years, maybe being 5 years, 5 years giving you a little bit longer runway to kind of get into it and a little more stability to that role.
Right.
What do you guys think about rotating the chair and having the past chair stay on the board? Because I think that could go in a variety of ways depending on personalities.
I'll make a few comments there. I do think that when you're in a smaller board with 3 people, 4 people, it's much harder, because usually on those smaller boards, everyone is on all committees. Mm-hmm. I think on a larger board, a 10, 15 person board, well, that's pretty large for right now, but where you have boards where not everyone is on that board, I do think that where you do that rotation of chairs almost needs to be a planning process, just like your skill set matrix, in terms of who's in line to do this, how much longer do they have on the board. I think in the question you asked, though, Dina, in a smaller board, I don't really see that much of a problem with having the past chair of, say, governance still be on the board. Because when you're in a smaller board, it's much more of a team effort, because you're all you have. In the larger boards, I don't really see it as a problem. If it was a problem, it would be a problem with more of a personal problem for somebody, as opposed to, I did it this way, so you should be doing it that way. I don't think those types of things happen as often on a small board.
Yeah, we have several clients who take different approaches, and one of them is certainly to have the chair position, including the chair of the board, rotate, and that's where you have an independent chair, obviously, and so that everyone can share in the responsibility. The ones I'm thinking of don't have any hard and fast rule as to how often that happens. It's more based upon, circumstance, and as the board is changing, what the needs of the board are. When there are new people who come in, that's a good opportunity to rotate some of those roles. And speaking of new people coming in, so there was a question that came in: how are your boards working to achieve diversity if that is a stated goal. And so maybe we can weave that into the conversation. You know, I do know some boards, some of our clients that we work with are very specific about trying to achieve some diversity or maintain some diversity. You know, if they're losing a board member, they want to make sure the replacement, not only with respect to, you know, age, gender, sex, or race, but, you know, you can also think about other ways to diversify your board with respect to, you know, what those skills are, what their background is. So any comments around that would be appreciated.
Go ahead, Anita.
Well, I'll go first. So the board, when I just joined, was the independent portion, because there's 5 members, one inside trustee. It was 3 gentlemen, and so they were looking for a diversity type candidate, whether that be by race or by gender. So I happened to, be lucky enough to be in the candidate pool. So they were specifically looking to not just have it be 3 gentlemen. And at this point, let's just be blunt, 3, Caucasian gentlemen. So I think there's some working towards that whole diversity angle. Dina, I don't know on your board if you've.
Yeah, I have been very fortunate. I think of the 3 boards where I'm affiliated, and when I joined, there were always 2 people who were joining at the same time. I would say that all 3 of my boards have more than 1 woman, so there's at least 2, if not more, women on the board. There's at least 2, if not more, people of color on our boards. And I was thinking about it as you guys were talking, of those 3 boards, 2 of the chairs are female and 1 lead independent trustee is female. So, I think we're getting there intentionally. But I think using that talent and skills matrix to at least have an awareness of the types of diversity variables you're looking for and tracking. As the lawyers would tell you, be very cognizant of how you're tracking that information because it's in a written format and we know it's a litigious environment. But at least have an awareness, have some closed door conversations about, how does diversity enhance your board and how can you intentionally, we're going to have our next segment on recruiting, but I think the networking needs to be very intentional because if you only go to the same people, you'll get the same candidates, right? So are you thinking more broadly about the resources where you're getting your networking? Are you looking at organizations you've never talked to before who may have recommended candidates? Are you going to conferences? Are you sort of thinking about expanding your network so your pipeline is naturally expanded? It's very strategic and intentional. And they're just data points. I don't know that people are using it as a single data point, but I think collectively, what somebody brings to the table, diversity is one of those data points that enhances who they are.
Yeah.
I don't really have a lot to add. I think Dina and Anita gave a very good overview. My board is quite small, 3 people and an interested. So that is 2 men and 2 women. My private company board is 5, and I'm the only woman on that board. So we haven't done a lot of work in that area.
I think, when you say it that way, I think it's difficult. And I know there are studies when an individual is the only, right? Whether it's the only woman or the only person of color or whatever the diversity point is. And from what I understand of the studies, when you have 2 and 3 and more, then that diversity point doesn't become so focused. It brings a great dynamic to the board, but it doesn't say, oh, well, that's the woman's perspective or that's the person of color's perspective. It just becomes additive. So hopefully going forward, we can sort of tackle these diversity challenges. But stay tuned for the recruiting conversation. We'll talk about that more.
We'll definitely talk about that more.
Yeah. Well, I think on some of the leadership discussions that we had in planning for this is really how to bring newer members into those roles. And we've talked about rotations. This is also a fairly small board, but we were very fortunate in that there are three of us who are actually, we could be the audit committee chair just based on our background. So that's probably a little unusual out of a board of four, but we've been a little fortunate on that. But I do think that, do think about this earlier in the game. Even if you're bringing some newer folks on, find ways to really have them sit in and listen and participate. Let's say you are a larger board and you are a little more diced in terms of not everyone sitting on the audit committee or not everyone being on the governance committee. Make sure that rotation is much more available. I think that's a really good start. And if you have the right leaders in place, then they really want to teach you the next steps or what they've learned over the last 10, 15 years. The ability to just kind of shadow those leaders. Or in my case, with our lead independent trustee, we both happen to be out of the same state. So after the meetings, we're not rushing off to catch a plane. So we'll just have a coffee after the board meeting, because I am newer to the board. And those have been super helpful because he's got a lot of institutional knowledge, which he's very willing to share and impart. And again, it's that sort of one-on-one time with the lead independent trustee that's just helpful to me, both for my learning as well as just, okay, what is his role all about? What is he all having to deal with? And he deals with a lot, in terms of he's very proactive with our management firm, with the investment firm. So, it's seeing that sort of side in a different way. So to the extent that you have those types of leaders, just, you're very lucky. I'm very lucky in that regard. The other thing, and Dina, we touched a little bit about this, is just in other ways to do it. You said, having these outings. I've been fortunate again in my prior life to actually have a firm that really enjoyed putting on board retreats. And I mean board retreats where everybody went to California, from the Midwest, and spent a good week, not only the board, but with the key individuals from, the investment management firm. And those were great because you would have breakfast, lunch, dinner, you would do some fun events, but then we would have a lot of conversation throughout the day, planned, conversations, folks, the portfolio managers coming for one of the days and just really having 8 hours, instead of your typical presentation of 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is per portfolio manager, but really being able to sit down with them and have those conversations. Now, in today's world with a lot of budgets and expenses, it's obviously more difficult to do, but, you could have these retreats in the town the night before, your board meeting, just those one-off, not have it be part of the official board meeting. And I don't know, Dina, if you've done some of those things, but I think it's just really helpful to see another side of the board and the management company.
Elsie?
Anita, I just want to pick up on one point Anita made in her earlier part of this conversation, was about the board chair, the role of the board chair, and how much work, how much time is involved. And so when you are thinking about getting in a queue to be promoted or being talked to about being promoted to board chair at some point, I think you need to look at yourself and say, what are my leadership skills? What are my management skills? Because you really are the king, the linchpin between the fund company and the independent trustees. And not everyone is good at that role. Yeah. So I think that you really need to make sure you understand what you're stepping into and that you want to do it, because there's nothing more disruptive than to have a weak chair or to have a chair that steps down at some point.
And Elsie, I would say also on the flip side, and I did this when I was taking on the chair role, was I also asked each of the board members and management, what were their expectations of the board chair? So not only, what did I bring to the table, but what were they looking for to make sure I didn't accept the job for the wrong reasons. And I think, kind of going to board chair development, one of the tools we used is I shadowed our sitting chair over the course of an entire year, so 4 quarterly meetings before I actually was officially elected as chair. Now, I sort of assume that, informal vice chair role. I do think it becomes helpful if you identify kind of your future leader in advance, so that, you can take the time to do some development. I also know there are conferences focused on being a board chair or being a board leader. I think those skills are a little different than committee chairs. And I do think it's wise for people to think about that and make sure, you're not just sort of sitting back passively, but you're thinking about what that chair role entails. Not only the time, it does take time, it does take sort of almost project management skill sets. But there's also sort of what I talked about, that art and science, that relationship building and making sure you're bringing people into the conversation. And if you notice somebody's not comfortable, reaching out to them outside the meeting and making sure that all voices are heard around the table.
I mean, Dina, really, those chairs, the board chairman or lead independent, they really are they have to have the courageous conversations. So they do need to have the skill set to be able to do that effectively without stepping on management's toes, stepping on other board members' toes. You're absolutely spot on that. It is a specific skill set, whether it's learned from past experiences or that's, what their previous world was about. But it is a tough position sometimes. And they also are the ones, usually dealing a lot with council, fund council or independent trustee council. They spend a lot of time with them. So,
From my experience, I have on a quarterly basis a one-on-one with independent trustee council before the meeting. Mm-hmm. Then the two of us have a conversation with the management team next. Then my counsel and I get together right before the meeting, right before exec. And so, there is a lot of conversation. And again, we're trying to be aware and cost conscious, right? But it's time well spent. You need to run an effective meeting. It's not good enough to just show up for the meeting. You need to be strategic and tactical. And Cassandra, I can tell you've got some different experiences, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think those are all excellent points. And for, all of the trustees, I would say, whomever your counsel is, do feel free to reach out to them anytime, frankly. And particularly if you think there's a hole or there's something that you're not getting, that's, if counsel is counsel to the trust and the independent trustees, or even if it's just counsel to the trust, definitely engage your counsel. I mean, we're here to serve you, and the phone line's always open, the door is always open, so to speak. So I think that's great that you're coordinating with counsel before every meeting. I think most of our clients have some form of that, whether it's email or a formal scheduled call. Be what it may. And the chairman is hopefully giving some input on the agenda. There's a variety of ways to go about that.
No, we only have a few minutes left. And as I said at the beginning, we could just talk and talk and talk for hours. We had kind of talked a little bit about sort of traps to watch for in terms of succession planning. Do you guys have things that, if you were to give some sort of lessons learned to our audience, who is likely everyone's dealing with succession planning, whether they know it or not. And if they don't know it, they should be doing it, because you never know what's going to happen. But any lessons learned that you would say, here's a takeaway?
I would just say that, in terms of using your skill set matrix, try to be in agreement with what you want as a board before you go out to candidates. I've known candidates that said, I checked every box, or I checked 8 out of 10. And I got on there and they asked me about a subject that, they asked me about my knowledge in closed-end funds or something like that, that had absolutely nothing to do. So I would just say to try to be in as much agreement as a board yourself.
Yeah, and really the board culture, building the engagement across. Being a new trustee this year, I've tried to, and I'm usually very outgoing and I jump in a lot, but in this board meeting, I've had to a bit more than I normally would, because I think you want to sit back and really observe both how management interacts with the board and the board interacts with management, and just sort of learn. So for me, this first year, that's been sort of important, just that sort of learning, and how is this working? Is this very collegial? Is it a little contentious? Like, what type of board meetings are these? So I'm trying to not be my usual type A personality.
And one thing I wanted to suggest is really just transparency. Sometimes you go to have one of those courageous conversations and you realize not everyone is on the same page. So I think transparency, which, also applies to your self-assessment, any board retreats you're having, any sort of planning you are doing. Obviously, if there's something particularly sensitive that you want to discuss with the board or with counsel in private, do that. But it is most helpful when there's a lot of transparency, so everyone, feels free to put their ideas out there, and you can come to some sort of a consensus.
I think that's a wise point. It's kind of funny, obviously we've spent an hour talking about this, but when you first start, you think, what's the big deal? Just have an open, candid conversation. We're all adults. We've all been in the business world. We can do this. It's not as easy as you think. And if it's easy, you're probably not reading the room very well. There are a lot of emotions, feelings, opinions. Somebody may be biting their tongue because they have something they want to say, but they're not saying. Somebody may be talking over everybody else. I think there's a nuance to it. And if it starts to get heated, think about having conversations early in a more academic situation, right? So don't have the conversation 2 months before someone's going to retire. Try and have them 3 years before they retire, so it's not as close and personal. Think about leveraging your counsel to have some of the more difficult conversations, because they're more of a neutral person in the room. If it gets really sticky, think about bringing an outside facilitator to just allow everybody to have a conversation, so someone's not trying to mediate the conversation and you've got all these factions. But it seems like it would be easy. And I will tell you, if you're doing it right, it's not as easy as you think.
All right. Well, with that, I think we are just at 4:00. If anyone has any additional questions, feel free to reach out. As we did with the last 3-part series, we will be putting together an FAQ. And we will circulate that in the coming weeks after this first session, and then update it with each additional session. Our next one in this series is actually going to be Wednesday, April 16th. And as we've mentioned, that will focus on recruiting board members. So I want to thank everyone for attending today's program. And a special thank you to Dina, Elsie, and Anita for sharing your insights and sharing your time with us. When this webinar does end, you will be prompted to take a survey and provide any feedback. In there, if there are any topics you'd like us to cover in Coffee Chat, please let us know. Otherwise, thank you again and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
And Cassandra, I would say all three of us are available on LinkedIn if people want to reach out and connect with us.
Thank you very much. Yes, this is each series, the last one and this one. It's been a fantastic networking opportunity. And I see a lot of familiar names now on the attendee list. So that's fantastic.
Great. Thanks for hosting us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.